Welcome to everybody. It's a great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Professor Marcello Massimini. Marcello is a physician and a neurophysiologist, and he is a full professor of human physiology at the Department of Biomedical and Clinical Sciences of the University of Milan. He worked at Laval University in Quebec in the laboratory of Mircea Steriade, and subsequently he moved to the University of Wisconsin with Professor Giulio Tononi. Marcello has been a partner in different European grants and has received national and international prizes for his research. He is currently working on developing new tools for studying how human cortical excitability and connectivity change in pathological and physiological conditions. So today he's going to present the topic mechanisms of loss and recovery of consciousness, insights from cortical perturbations. So thanks, Marcello, and please.
Thank you, Anna. I don't remember. Is it okay? Can you hear me? Okay. And then Stefano for inviting me. Really, it's a lovely place, by the way, where you work. Yeah, yeah, but in general, I mean, it's really nice. And so I'm gonna do an experiment today, in a way. Forgive me, because for the first time, I'll try to condense and compress like 12 years of work in one talk of 45 minutes, more or less. So this is my actual, the aim. I don't know if I'll succeed. But in a way, I mean, it's not that I'm taking you as, as guinea pigs, but it's just, I want to do it because I want to, also have your opinion on this stuff. So I'll go from, from extracranial recordings to intracranial, different models, basically the whole story of, where we are with this adventure. And let me say up front, before everything else, that whatever I will show today is, comes from it's a teamwork between different, institutions, and of course, University of Milan, the Coma Science Center in Liège, directed by Stephen Loris, and then, of course, University of Wisconsin with Giulio Tononi, and Niguarda Hospital for the intracranial data in epileptic patients. And so what's the story that I'm going to tell? It's basically, a journey in the brain at the borders of consciousness between, states where consciousness is present, fades, recovers, maybe in the form of a dream, by a perturbational perspective. So we'll basically try to see what changes in the brain, in the matter of the brain, the physical substrate of consciousness, where consciousness comes and goes, by applying perturbation, basically by knocking directly on the cortex and listening to, the echo that the cortex produces. And we do these perturbations in many different ways, perturbation and recordings. So non-invasively with transcranial magnetic stimulation and EEG, as you see here, but also intracranially by applying intracortical perturbation and LFP recordings, and also EEG simultaneously. And the aim of these experiments, which we started in 2003, 2004 in Wisconsin, was, I would say, threefold. So, first of all, we wanted to test a theoretical postulate or prediction that consciousness has to do with a specific form of complexity in thalamocortical circuits. And, we shall see later what kind of complexity this is. Second, we wanted to improve the ability to detect consciousness at the bedside, because there's a problem there in clinical neurology. We're not sensitive enough to recovery of consciousness. And third, which is the title of my talk, but it's the last part indeed, is gaining insight on the mechanisms of loss and recovery of consciousness. So these are the three things. The first is theoretical, the second is clinical, diagnostic, and the third is physiopathological. So I'll try to go through all this, starting though from the clinical problem, because it's the easiest way for me to introduce consciousness without going in, getting philosophical. So this is a coma patient. Coma is a state that is similar to sleep, except for the patient cannot be awakened, not even with painful stimuli. Eyes closed. unresponsiveness, and not arousable. This is coma. Coma is a transient state. So normally it lasts for, when you read on the newspaper, it emerges from coma after 10 years, it's always wrong, because coma lasts for 2-3 weeks normally. Then what happens normally is, well, if the patient doesn't go towards brain death, is the patient, they open their eyes. And from that point on, it's not coma anymore, when there is this recovery of vigilance. And recovery of vigilance is due to the fact that brainstem neurons that are suffering at the beginning after a brain injury because they are compressed and squeezed down, they recover a little bit, so you have eyes opening and recovery of basically the function of activating systems. Best case scenario is that the patient opens his eyes and communicates, maybe squeezing hands or talking, no doubts, he's conscious. Worst case scenario, recovery of wakefulness, awareness, wakefulness, vigilance in, neurological terms, but no signs of awareness. Basically, the patient is not responsive. Only automatic activity, reflex activity, nothing purposeful, no response to commands. This state where you have, vigilance, but you don't have awareness, or you don't have consciousness, is the vegetative state, otherwise called unresponsive wakefulness syndrome. And it's already a complicated state. Then, to make things even more complicated, in 2002, a new state came up called the minimally conscious state. This is a gray area. It's a boundary zone where patients are basically, practically speaking, they provide signs of consciousness. They respond to command every once in a while, or maybe typically they track people with their eyes in the room, like nurses or relatives. But they do it today, or they do it now. They don't do it in an hour. They don't do it tomorrow. They fluctuate a lot. Very difficult to detect. But there are definite, signs of consciousness. They're just fluctuating. And we don't know where these patients are. They could be like fully conscious but fully paralyzed, some of them might be in a dreamlike state or in a state of hallucination, some of them in an intermediate state of consciousness, like when we fall asleep or we recover from anesthesia. We don't know. We know that they are conscious to some extent, and we also know, and this is crucial, that they have a better prognosis if they undergo rehabilitation. They can recover, even after 10 years, 15 years. So it's crucial to detect them for ethical, clinical, and many reasons. Thing is, there is a big detection error here. I mean, it is estimated that 40% of this minimally conscious state are erroneously labeled as vegetative. This is because the signs are inconsistent, difficult to detect, amidst all this reflex activity. It's very challenging to detect this patient. I could show you examples, but we don't have time for this. So this is a big problem. So we are not sensitive enough to consciousness. We can detect everything with our machines, fMRI, if you will vote for Democrats or Republicans, if you're really in love, or you're faking being in love, if you prefer Pepsi or Coke, but then you don't know. Really, it's hard to detect, really practically speaking, to detect, to decide whether somebody is conscious or not, which is an ontological difference between existing or not subjectively. So this is a big problem. And why do we have this problem, such a big problem? Because, normally we don't know what are the mechanisms of consciousness, and we treat the brain as a black box, so we work on input-output relationship. And this is what we do every day in the emergency room, in the intensive care departments, where basically you ask patients to do things, squeeze your hand, open your eyes, do this and that, and you look at motor behavior. If you have motor responses that are specific and reliable, you say he's conscious, no doubt. I mean, it's what we do between ourselves. Are you awake? You say, yes, I trust you. If not, the patient is unconscious. But is it really the case? No. Actually, take this simple example. What if the patient is fully paralyzed? Outputs are interrupted. The patient understands, would like to give signs of consciousness, but is just fully paralyzed. He can't talk, can't squeeze hands, nothing. And this happens, yes, it happens. So this is the locked-in syndrome. You know what it is. It's a lesion in the ventral parts of the pons, which basically cuts out all the fibers going from the cortex to the spinal cord, except for, typically, the third cranial nerve, which actually permits blinking and vertical eye movement. So sooner or later, this patient, they start moving their eyes. But the thing is that even when they do so, it is difficult to detect them. Oftentimes, this happens, after weeks or months. And these patients are desperately trying to communicate, and only at some point, maybe a nurse or a relative realizes that these are not random movements and asks the questions, well, if you understand me, do it twice. And the patient does it. If you want to say yes, you do it once. If you want to say no, you do it twice. And then you have this binary code. And the patient finally is recognized as conscious and can communicate, which makes a huge difference. But in some cases, you also have the total locked-in syndrome. With these movements are not possible. So what do you do here? How do we, can we accept this situation? How many patients are like this? And we think they're vegetative, and actually they're in a full locked-in syndrome. So of course, the scientific community and the medical community tried to address the problem. And I give you an example that is, well, we don't have motor outputs because they're blocked. We can still stimulate the subject, ask him to do things, and record, neuronal responses instead of motor responses. We bypass this motor blockage. So this was the idea that basically, triggered this famous study in Cambridge, which is called an active paradigm. Basically, what it is that in normal controls, if you put them in a scanner and you ask them to imagine to play tennis, for instance, you have this beautiful activation SMA. If you ask them instead to navigate in their own apartment from the kitchen to the bedroom, you have this activation of a different constellation of areas, which makes sense: memory, spatial temporal coordinates, and movement, and so on. So this is just like squeeze my right hand or my left hand. You take it as a proxy of movement, meaning that the patient understood, wanted to do that. Of course, it requires some concentration in the scanner to produce this activation. You need to concentrate and think and really, get into playing tennis or navigate in your house, but you can do that. And that is a sign of a willful, activation, voluntary act, understanding, and so on. So, no, you have to take it as you squeeze your hand or so on. So, this is in control patients, and then they tried in vegetative state patients. So this is a young, 22 years old, traumatic brain injury girl. She was diagnosed as vegetative, so no sign whatsoever, no response to command, and actually she was able to produce these activations. This is a very important study. It's a proof of principle, and actually it reveals, that the doubt that we miss consciousness is actually true. There are patients that are there. They can produce willful activation that are just blocked on the motor side. Is this the solution? Can we, screen people with an MRI scanner with this active paradigm and detect consciousness with eye sensitivity? The answer, unfortunately, is no. Yes, in some specific patients, you can do that, and you can also, try to communicate with them in a very slow manner. With a convention, you imagine to play tennis to say yes, and you imagine to navigate in your house to say no. Very slow. So it's good. But the fact is that the sensitivity of this technique is extremely low. It's not acceptable how low it is. So actually, if you look at the paper, which became famous for detecting consciousness, the real message is that you don't detect it. Like out of 31 minimally conscious patients, who are conscious because they show that they are conscious behaviorally, you don't have these activations. So the sensitivity is, like 3%. You expect to miss a lot of patients. When consciousness is there and they show it, can you imagine how many you miss in the vegetative state condition? So it cannot be used as a screening test. It's very specific, but it's not sensitive at all. And, it doesn't even work sometimes in controls, and it doesn't even work in patients who have recovered verbal communication. Because, why? Because it's asking a lot to a brain-injured patient. To imagine, it requires memory, attention, concentration, motivation, and all this, and it's not a given. But even more important, it requires that inputs are getting to the brain. You need to understand, you need to process this sensory information in order to be able to react. And the thing is that consciousness actually can be there not only in the absence of output, but it's also independent on input. You don't need sensory input to be conscious. They're not necessary. So they're not sensitive. They're not sensitive. We can be conscious, conscious can be generated within. And we know it because every night we dream, and the dream is generated within the thalamocortical system without a single input, electrical impulse coming in or going out. You can tape eyes open to a subject who's in REM sleep and show him a movie, not a single frame would enter the dream. We are fully disconnected and physiologically paralyzed. No input, no output. Still, we're conscious. So we know it can be generated within, independently of input and output, but we keep measuring it based on input-output relationship just because of lack of better options. But we know it doesn't work. So this is actually the problem. And the problem is serious. It's not a theoretical issue, it's a principal problem. But it's really serious because we are producing a lot of strange brains with intensive care medicine. Things that 50 years ago couldn't have survived, these kind of brains, because we support brains during the coma, we prevent them to go into brain death, and then we save islands or archipelago of pieces of cortex, and we don't know how it feels to be an isolated chunk of cortex, maybe an hemisphere without input and output. What does it feel like? Is it like dreaming? Is it like being hallucinating? Is it good? Is it bad? How does it feel to be many islands, maybe weakly connected? Or, we are producing brains that, we never encountered before, and we have to assume that, there might be somebody there, but just disconnected. So we need really to develop measures that are theoretically grounded, so they do not depend on input and output, but also, they are practically useful, the thing we need to develop. So measures that are independent on sensory processing and motor behavior. Not easy. Those would be called the neural correlates of consciousness. That is, what aspects of neuronal activity are sensitive and specific for the presence of consciousness. And again, the community has been, putting a lot of effort in here. We have recently reviewed this effort with Christoph Koch in this review, and I just give you the gist. One could talk for 3 hours about the quest for neural correlates of consciousness. It's a long story, and the bottom line is that we don't have a good one that is sensitive and specific enough across conditions and at the individual level. Just to give a few examples of principles. So one could think levels of neuronal activity. Simple-minded, hypothesis is the more the brain is active, the more conscious you are. When it shuts down, you're unconscious. Actually, this is what we thought before about sleep. When you go into non-REM sleep, the brain shuts down, basically, and you're unconscious. But this is not true. We know that. For instance, sleep is, sometimes average firing rate are as high as in wakefulness. Different patterns of activity, but they can be as high as in wakefulness. Patients, it's true that when you undergo brain injury, you have a loss of neurons and you have alteration in the metabolism, so it can go down. This is a PET scan from conscious to a vegetative state. But it's also true when the patient recovers, they don't necessarily recover brain activity. So it's not, necessary in a way. And then there is the striking case, I love this one, of seizures. This is an absence seizures occurring at time 0. What happens at time 0? Now, there's a big ignition of fronto-parietal activity. Huge. Then recovery of consciousness, suppression of activity. It's the opposite. So normally, you would say, well, an ignition of activation in the fronto-parietal system is consciousness, and then when you have a suppression, no, it's the opposite during seizures. It's completely the opposite. So you have widespread increase in neuron activation, loss of consciousness, decreases in neuron activation, you recover. So there must be a strange balance there. You would not be able to build a consciousness meter based on firing rates or metabolic rates. It may be prognostic maybe because, metabolic rates, they say the neurons are there, they're working. But it's not neither specific or sensitive. Synchrony, it's an interesting idea, old story. Binding requires synchrony and integration through synchrony and all this. So one could measure synchrony and, maybe derive a nice, reliable measure of the level or capacity for consciousness. And it works in general, so in some frequency bands. but there are too many exceptions, far too many exceptions. Take anesthesia. Anesthesia, like propofol anesthesia, can put you into, full unconsciousness by increasing frequency, synchrony in alpha, beta range. So, extreme case again is seizures. Seizures, you have an increased widespread hypersynchronous also in the gamma band, this is intracranial data, and loss of consciousness. So, here also, it's really difficult. Then one could say spectral features, entropy, waves of DEG, regularity in DEG. Sure, this is another good idea, definitely, worth looking at. Indeed, we know that, there are differences between wake and sleep in DEG, in the waves, slow waves during sleep, they reflect downstates in the neurons, and then desynchronization in wakefulness. Surely interesting, but does it work? Is it sensitive and specific? The truth is that, look at this. This is another great example, I think. So you would say, based on what you know and what's, textbook knowledge on the EEG, that this is an EEG, low amplitude, high frequency, conscious, wakefulness, awareness. And that EEG is big, slow waves, low frequency, unconscious. Well, actually, this is alpha coma, full unconsciousness, and this is status epilepticus in a 9-year-old boy who's conscious and behaving. There are these paradoxes. And in general, there is a correlation between the level of vigilance and the spectrum of the EEG, but not always. Even because, and that's why also, for instance, simple metrics like, measuring spectral entropy or, the bispectral index proposed by anesthesiologists, they don't work. Because there are all these exceptions. They work in some cases, but not in all cases. And after all, one also has to think about that. What we see from the EEG is not necessarily what happens into the neurons, because slow waves can be present in the scalp, but maybe not below, because slow waves are local. Some parts of the brain are in a steady, activated state. Some other parts are producing slow waves and downstate. And it's not necessarily reflected in the scalp. And it depends on which area is engaging in slow waves and which is not. So, many problems here. So this is just to say, it's not to be hyper-negative about the search for neural correlates of consciousness, but the message is empirical search, where you try this and this and this and this and this, didn't work so well. So we don't have a measure that is practically useful at the bedside and that is theoretically okay, like it's sensitive and specific. And so that's why we took, at the beginning, a theoretical approach. So we started from this theory, which is the integration information theory formulated by Tononi in Wisconsin, Edelman, together with Edelman, and so on, which, it would take another 2 hours to describe, and I wouldn't even be able to do it properly, so I leave it to the papers and to Tononi. But the basic message, so here, there's a review here, again, which might be useful. But, just to give the basic message, the basic principle, postulate of the theory, is that, first of all, this theory does not start from the brain, which is a very interesting thing, because, normally you try to squeeze consciousness out of the brain, but that doesn't work, because consciousness, first and foremost, the only thing you know about consciousness is your experience, and you have to start from your experience. This is the axiom, is what you know. And then you postulate something about the brain, but you don't do the reverse. So this is what the theory does, starts from phenomenological axiom and goes to the brain. And the phenomenological axiom, the fundamental one, is that consciousness is rich in information and integrated at the same time. Or the neural substrate of consciousness, physical substrate, is differentiated and integrated at the same time. What does it mean? Richness of information is not because we can perceive rich scenes that are complicated and rich of features. Richness of information is something that we don't notice, but it's always there, even when we perceive pure dark. Because when you perceive pure dark, at that very moment, you rule out an infinite number of alternative states that you could have experienced, but you didn't. This is the information, in Shannon terms. So when it's dark, it's highly informative because of what it rules out, not because of what it is. So this is the information in the integration theory. So in a fraction of the second, the machinery of the brain is able to select one out of trillions of states. So it means that the machine has to have mechanisms that are highly differentiated inside. At the same time, when it enters one state out of the many, it does it as one piece, fully integrated, and indeed you won't be able to enter two states at the time. You either see the phase or the base, but you would alternate between the two. So, just brutally, this is what the theory starts from. That is this balance, unique balance between unity and diversity, integration information, and we will call it complexity from now on, just to be, for simplicity. And what it means in architectural terms, at least, again with brutal examples using this very simple system, is that it's a balance. So this is a system that is clearly differentiated. There are specific cytoconnections. Each element has different properties, but it's modular. On the other end of the spectrum, you have systems like this that are fully integrated, all-to-all connection, but for the same reason they lack freedom. They don't have a lot of information. They all do the same things. It's a very delicate balance at all levels, psychological, sociological, but even more so in physical systems. The more you try to differentiate the system, the less they can talk to each other, the elements, the more you make connections, the more they become homogeneous, and it's a delicate balance. And indeed, it takes a lot of computation for a computer to optimize a simple system for high levels of information integration, that is this balance between functional differentiation and functional integration. And it's also difficult to measure this balance, because we have good measures for integration, that is, we've mentioned already, synchrony, plenty of measures, phase locking, synchrony, coherence, you name it. But these measures are not sensitive to the differentiation of the pattern. You can have hypersynchronous activity, but very stereotypical, like in seizures. And then we have good measures for information, like entropy. They capture information, but they don't make sure that this information is generated by one system. You can have high entropy, but you don't know whether this entropy is generated by segregated elements that are fully independent and maybe noisy, or it is generated through the causal interaction within the system that is one, ontologically one, that exists as one system. It's a huge difference between one system with a lot of information and the collection of many systems with little information that you are putting together. So, and also, that's why, probably these measures, they don't really work so well. So we thought that, the practical way to measure the balance is to perturb the system. It's not enough to observe the system, but to perturb it. And the rationale, in a way, it's simple, because the idea is that, you perturb the system directly, and you measure the spatiotemporal dynamics triggered by the perturbation. And the idea is that in a system that is modular, you're going to have a response that is local in space and time, and a system that is unbalanced by the other side of the spectrum, you have another kind of response. But let me stress the difference here between what the edge of perturbing. So imagine that you have this situation, and you have a common driver which is hidden, you're not measuring, and you're recording from these elements. And you measure, temporal correlations, synchrony, coherence, and phase locking value, and so on. So you would say, based on this measurement, that this system is one, is integrated, because they are, you have this functional correlation, temporal correlations, functional connectivity. But actually, then you perturb this system, and you see that this is the case. So there's a huge difference between perturbing and observing. Also, when you only are considering integration, you have many instances where you think something is integrated based on coherence, but it's not when you perturb. So this is a key difference. So, and then if you encounter a system like this and you perturb, you get a response that is, yes, this time is global, widespread, but it's stereotypical. It's all or none. And only if you get a system that is balanced where different elements are different set of connections, but they are still, connected with short path length, you have this kind of complex dynamic. So in this way, the idea is that by perturbing, you capture this balance by a causal perspective. So it's causal interactions versus temporal correlation. It's integration and differentiation at the same time. And crucially, it's independent from input and output, because you're perturbing directly the system. You're not working on input and output. You're probing the intrinsic information that is integrated within the system. So this is different from the empirical markers. Level of activity, clearly different. You can have high levels of activity, but no information. Synchrony, clearly different. Spread of activity is different. Entropy is different, because if the entropy is not integrated, it doesn't count. And ERPs, like sensory evoked potential, is different because they're bypassed. So this is the principle. So basically, it's the amount of information that is generated intrinsically through causal interactions in the system. How do we measure that? So for now, one way to measure it is not the best, but it's a practical one, is to combine all tools. TMS, neuronavigation possibly, and high-density electroencephalography. So you perturb a piece of cortex, a patch of neurons directly, you knock on the brain, on the cortex directly, and then with EEG, you record the echo that is produced by the thalamocortical system. And it goes in that direction. I mean, it's really, it approximates, this measure. So basically what you measure here is cortical evoked potentials with decent spatiotemporal resolution. And so let's see the data. So the first experiment we ran is the most familiar condition where consciousness comes and goes. Sleep. Fall asleep, entry, early in the night, basically you don't exist. How do we know? Because you wake up the subject, you ask him what was going on in your mind, and normally it's, I didn't exist, I don't remember. At least I don't remember, I don't know, I wasn't there. So this is the typical response to TMS in wakefulness. So you have, which is already, a sign of, in a way, integration and information, because you have, first of all, that many channels are reacting to a local perturbation, integration, and then each channel is doing it in a specific way. And then if you go and look at the spatiotemporal dynamic, so after source modeling, you see that actually, yes, you have a local activation at the beginning, and then it spreads and it percolates to the system in a way that is specific and global at the same time. This is all deterministic. This is after statistics, and after, we deliver 200 perturbations, and then we only take the deterministic activity, what is causally due to the perturbation. So you see, it's a complex pattern of causal deterministic interaction, and you can summarize this in one snapshot where latency is color-coded, and then falling asleep, exact same perturbation, the same structure, the same neurons, the same intensity of stimulation, and it changes completely. It's incredible when you see it on the screen, and you know that somebody is sleeping just by looking at this evoked potential, which changes dramatically, gets bigger, so the brain is active and reactive, but it changes. You see, it's like a positive, negative wave. And if you look at the spatiotemporal dynamic, corresponding spatiotemporal dynamic, you see that it's center of gravity of neuron activity is always there. So maybe it's a strong activation, but it's very stereotypical and stable, right? Local, like this. And then if you try to, because then you could say, well, maybe neurons are a little bit hyperpolarized, it's just a matter of threshold. I have to hit harder the brain, and if you really hammer strong with TMS, so this looks a little bit like this. But if you give a strong pulse, you increase TMS to 160% motor threshold, which is a lot, you get the best result you have. It's a even bigger up and down wave, and a pattern that is, again, stereotypical. It's like an oil spot, like this. It's like tossing a stone in a pond, and you have these waves. Very simple. It's just like an homogeneous system. So basically, when consciousness is lost in non-REM sleep, you never have this balance. You go either it's blocked, or if you try to overcome the blockage, you have a bigger and stereotypical response, which was encouraging. REM sleep, interesting case, because consciousness comes back in somebody who's not responsive, is a good test for, before going to patients. So this is the response in wakefulness. The typical response, stereotypical response in non-REM, and subject reports not being conscious, and then in REM sleep, before you wake him up and he tells you a story, you know that, you measure a complex response. Sort of trivial, because also the EEG is different, but it makes sense by the point of view of the theory. And now we have data, I don't have it here, it's a work by Olivia Gosri in Scientific Report, that also when you contrast within non-REM sleep, when you dream and when you don't dream, so the EEG being equal, you have more complex waves when you report a dream and when you don't. So it's a within state paradigm that works. Anesthesia. Important because, this is a pharmacological manipulation of consciousness. If the measure holds in general, it must hold whatever the mechanism is. So this is midazolam, the first anesthetic we tried. Then we tried propofol, a typical anesthetic. It's used every day. And you always have this sleep-like response. Positive, negative wave, and local pattern of activation. It can be sometimes a bigger wave, but it's always the same wave that propagates more or less, but it's simple. This is xenon. It's another type of anesthetic. This works more on potassium channels. This is more GABA B. And then the crucial test for us was ketamine. Ketamine is very interesting, and it was a scary test for us because ketamine is a state, I don't know if you know these anesthetics, but it's very peculiar. It's not used anymore, although it's very effective because it puts you in a state of full disconnection. You can have surgery. You don't know you're having surgery. You're okay, except for you are hallucinating like crazy. So you're very conscious, but somewhere else, dreaming of incredible things, and you have surgery. Sometimes these things can be unpleasant, so then you wake up and you complain, and so it's been, it's not used anymore. So ketamine is a perfect model of full disconnection because the subject, if you do the coma recovery scale, is like vegetative state. You can have surgery, you can be open, but then you report a long, long story. So there is a consciousness that is disconnected. So what happens, and also the EEG pattern is, it's sort of ambiguous. So what happens is that the response is complex, just like in wakefulness, although there is full disconnection and no signs of behavioral consciousness. And in spite of an EEG, this is the wakefulness EEG, and this is the ketamine EEG that is really, you have slow waves, you have K complexes, you have a lot of theta. It's not the wakefulness EEG. But if you perturb, you reveal a core of complexity, and indeed the subject wakes up and tells you a story. So this is, all the benchmark tests that we did before moving our equipment to Liège, where the patients are. And then, yes?
Actually, go back to the previous slide.
Yes.
I just was curious whether you have also formal measure of complexity out of that can use. It's quite clear.
Yes. Yes. So I'll come to the quantification. Indeed, all this is completely descriptive for now. It's eyeball complexity, and then we'll measure it. I just want to go through the full data set in order to, to have a sense of it, and then I'll show how the quantification is. So the patients, so the first patient we studied, he had a traumatic brain injury in the left hemisphere, vegetative. I would say, based on the clinical consensus, he was really vegetative because it's been studied for many years, this patient. And so it was the first patient we tested. And vegetative state patients, since the brainstem is functioning, they have sleep-wake cycles. So sometimes they are eyes closed, and sometimes they are eyes open with some, automatic activity. So the first time we measured was in this sleep condition. It really looks like sleep, natural sleep. And of course, you have to stimulate the hemisphere that is intact. If you stimulate the left, where there are no neurons, you have no response. So you have to, with the navigation, select the islands of cortex. In this case, it's one hemisphere. You perturb it, and it's in a sleep-like state, but it makes sense. He was actually sleeping. The thing, the dissociation, is that in this patient, even when eyes were open and there was reflex activity, the thalamocortical system was stuck in a sleep-like state. So there's this dissociation between the mechanism of arousal and the mechanism of, thalamocortical integration somehow. this sleep-like response is typical of vegetative state patients. I think this is an interesting message in itself, except for the ones that are post-anoxic, where, you know, after cardiac arrest, all neurons are, basically cortical neurons are dead, which are flat. All the others, they respond in a sleep-like way, positive, negative way. You know, everything converges in this sleep-like response. Then locked-in patients are as you know, very similar to wakefulness. And what was crucial for us, is the minimally conscious patients, the ones that are difficult to detect, and we have no good measures in them, no objective measure to detect them, sensitive enough. You have responses that are clearly different. You see it on the screen, and you see that this response is different from this one. So this is the overall description of the data. And I just want to add that in longitudinal measurement, you see things like this. So this is an interesting case. She emerges from coma, eyes open, unresponsive, first measurement. You know, she's labeled as vegetative in the clinic, and you have this kind of sleep-like response. Then after 10 days, the nurse says, well, maybe she was following me in the room with her eyes. So we go back, we perform the measurement, and but she was still VS by all means. When you do the scales, no responses. She had just this little thing that the nurse noticed, but inside, you know, if you perturb and you look at the cortical response, that was already very different, a different cortical response, although the label was still VS. And then after she recovered, the ability to communicate consciousness, but the core was already there. So it's just a matter of, you know, it's probably she was already building up some capacity for consciousness here, which became behavioral only later on. Now, this is all descriptive, eyeball things. Now, the next challenge was to find a way that is, you know, theoretically relevant to quantify this kind of complexity. And the idea was to develop this so-called perturbational complexity index, which works like this. So the rationale is that you need to perturb the cortex directly, thalamocortical system, record the response, so this is TMSEG. Then you extract the deterministic pattern of spatio-temporal activation. You binarize the pattern, active is 1, non-active is 0, and then you compress using Lampelet-Ziv compression. Yeah, there's a normalization for source entropy, but basically it's the same compression that you use for you know, zip files. And the idea is the following, the rationale. If you have a system that is in this condition, functionally in this condition, you are going to have a local response, a matrix that is easy to compress. And so high compressibility means low complexity, low perturbational complexity. On the other end of the spectrum, you have a system like this. You have a huge matrix, but the matrix is redundant because all the elements are doing the same things. You don't need a lot of information to compress, and again, you're going to have a low PCI. Only if a system is balanced, there is this conjoint presence of integration differentiation, you're going to have matrices that are you know, widespread, but difficult to compress. Different elements doing different things at different times. So high PCI. So this is the, you know, rationale behind. So again, this gets closer to the flavor of this phi measure that Tononi developed of integration and information. And although it's tractable, you can do it practically. So now, the thing is, now I'm going to go into a boring section of 3 minutes. I'll fly on this because this is very clinical, but it's crucial about consciousness. So now you have a measure, and the thing that typically you would do, that's been done, is, oh, I have a candidate. Now I take a population of 40 vegetative state patients, 40 minimally conscious patients, and I do a receiving operator curve, and I see the sensitivity and the specificity. This is what everybody does. And they come up with sensitivity. Is it correct? It doesn't make any sense. You don't have a ground truth because you don't know whether a VS patient is conscious or not. And this is the point. It's circular. It's completely circular. So you are validating a measure with a performance that is not known in patients in whom the state of affairs is not known. And there are most of the papers in coma are like this. You take minimally conscious versus vegetative. But you know who are the positive, who are the negatives. So what do you expect? I mean, it's completely circular. So you have to take a much longer, approach that is, first, you calibrate and validate your measure in a benchmark population who's able to report about the state of consciousness. The only thing you know about consciousness is your consciousness, and you can do experiments on yourself, and then you have to trust the report of healthy people. I was dreaming, I was there, I wasn't there. There you can calibrate your measure. Then you apply the cutoff that you derive to patients. So I want to make this story short because it's clinical, it's boring, it's not the point. But anyways, the benchmark population that we took to validate the measure is composed of subjects who are able to report. Who? Healthy controls. Locked-in syndrome patient, they can do it with their eyes. Stroke patient, they have big lesions, but they can talk to you, or they can signal that they're conscious. And emergence from the minimal conscious state, severe brain injury. They can all tell you they're conscious, although they have injuries. So it's a good test for a measure. Then another challenge. Then the negative side is the no report. People telling you, I didn't exist. So these conditions. Then there is another challenge for the measure, which is the delayed report. People who are at the moment are responsive, but then they wake up and tell you, I was there, dreaming, REM sleep, and ketamine. Okay? So then you have positive here and negative here, negatives here. And the positive is, it's interesting because, there's a nice stress test for the measure here because you are including brain injury and unresponsiveness. So you're really, pushing it a little bit for the measurement. And then you do receiving operator analysis and you come up with a cutoff, and then you apply the cutoff to the patients to see where they are. So this is the approach. So, I'll be short. This is the no report condition in the benchmark population, values of PCI, delayed report, disconnected consciousness, immediate report, including brain injured patient, stroke, locked in, subcortical stroke, cortical stroke, emergence from the MCS. Then you do receiving operator, and you come up with your cutoff. And there are technical things we can discuss about this. We take the upper bound of complexity, the maximum complexity the system generates when we do different perturbations. You have this, cutoff, which is highly sensitive and highly specific. Actually, it's 100%. And then you use the same cutoff derived from this benchmark population to slice through the patients. So the first test, before going to the unknown land of vegetative state patients, is to make sure that you are detecting minimally conscious patients. So the rate of detections of other measures, brain-derived measure, is for fMRI active paradigm, 3% sensitivity. For the P300 ERP is 30%. For the EEG is about 60%, slow waves, alpha delta ratio. Now, what's the performance of this theory-driven measure? If you take minimally conscious patients and you use the cutoff, you're missing only 2 out of 38. So the sensitivity is about 94%, so it's much higher. And why is it? Because perturbing is more than observing. Look at this typical patient. So this is within the MCS state, fully conscious, not fully. They are conscious behaviorally. You can have many spontaneous patterns, severely abnormal, moderately abnormal, mildly abnormal. This could be the same pattern you have in a VS patient. This is similar to somebody who's almost, a control. In spite of this, complexity is stable. You have high complexity in all cases. And then the unknown. So this is the interesting part. So here, you have nothing to say about these patients because you don't know where they are, because you assume that you're missing consciousness. Some of them might be really unconscious. Some of them could be disconnected but conscious, and so on. So what do we see here? 3 ways of being in a vegetative state by the electrophysiological point of view. The first way is flat, no response. PCI 0, because there is no response to TMS. All these patients are post-anoxic. They have diffuse brain injury, basically a Palazzo syndrome. They don't have a cortex. Then there is another pattern that is the low complexity pattern, sleep-like patients. you perturb, you have islands of cortex, but these islands are stuck in a sleep-like low complexity state. And then you have a third important category, that is the high complexity patients. 19% of VS patients are in this condition. And then, given the calibration and the validation that we perform in the benchmark population, and given the fact that we know that complexity can be high when consciousness is present but disconnected, and the complexity in the benchmark population is high only when consciousness is present and always low when consciousness is absent, you have to say, or at least you have to pay special attention to these patients, assuming that actually there is something that you don't see in behavior, that this thalamocortical system has retained a capacity for consciousness that you don't see just because you're working on input and output. So this is the basic message, right? So there's these three partitions of patients that are otherwise labeled as VS. No response, low complexity, high complexity. So what do you do about this, practically speaking? Well, first of all, the prognosis is different. So meaning, it's not that this is a prognostic index. It says that, when you have a capacity for consciousness, it is more likely that then you can express it. So these patients, they can recover. So the red one is they move to the MCS state, so they show consciousness sooner or later. They never do. They do less so. So these are small numbers. It was not a prognostic study, but just to show that, sooner or later they tend to come out. But the thing is, what's the physiological interpretation here? So this is apallic syndrome. And even, in fact, if you do a PET scan here, you see that there is no metabolism. Trivial, in a way. Here, it gets more interesting. So what do you do in these patients? Practically speaking, after all this effort, what you have to do is that you have to assume that there is a physical substrate that is capable of consciousness. You just have to push the channels to express it in the input or output side. Or maybe you have to improve and push executive function in the frontal lobe, because maybe they have some sort of akinetic mutism due to the lesion and all this. So there are ways to do this. One way, Nico Schiff and others in New York, you can do thalamic stimulation to try to push a little bit the front and the basal ganglia in the front, which improves motor output. Then you can actually try to bypass the blockage by BMI, brain-machine interface, or different kind of, you select these patients for the active paradigm, but then you look for the right paradigm for these patients in order to let them communicate. And there are many ways, both with fMRI or EEG. But basically, it's a stratification that tells you these patients, they have a problem with communication. Instead, these patients, they have a problem with the thalamocortical system and with complexity. They're stuck in a low complexity state for some reason. And these, I think, are the most interesting. I mean, these are obviously ethically relevant, but these are, by the point of view of, of a neurophysiologist, this is the most interesting case, because here you have a system where the structure is not worse than this one. So these patients, they don't have necessarily, they might have more brain than these ones, but this structure is stuck in a functional state of low complexity. And to the extent that complexity has critical levels and it depends on properties in a nonlinear way, then there is maybe the possibility that these patients are just below the threshold for, having higher complexity. And then you can push complexity a little bit. So this is the challenge, and this is, where I want to end my talk. So what are the mechanisms of this loss and recovery complexity? Do you still have patients, like 10 minutes? Can we do it? So, now, let's go back to sleep, because this is a sleep-like response, after all. So, why does complexity collapse in sleep? Why this, complex spatiotemporal pattern collapses into a stereotypical response into a positive-negative slow wave? There must be a reason, even because nobody is cutting the synapses. This is a physiological state where the structure remains the same. There must be some change, functional change in the way neurons are working postsynaptically, possibly. So, one hypothesis is that the mechanism for this collapse of complexity is the same mechanism that underlies the generation of slow waves in sleep. That is neuronal bistability. So what happens is that when you fall asleep, the activating system, noradrenergic, glutamatergic, and so on, they cease firing, or they decrease their firing rate. And what happens in the cortical neurons is that they open activity-dependent potassium currents. They become stronger. So neurons in this condition, they become active, and then there is this pressure for adaptation into hyperpolarization. They fall into a downstate. Then they recover activity, and they fall again into a downstate, and so on. And this is what gives rise to the delta that you see on the scalp. So this bistability due to activity-dependent potassium, mainly currents. So in this condition, neurons are receiving an input. When they receive an input, they activate, but they cannot sustain it. They shut down, then there's this long silent period, and then they recover activity, maybe stochastically. So we thought, maybe this is a killer for complexity, this bistability, which is a very simple mechanism. So we wanted to test this in sleep first. And so we had a good indication from some preliminary modeling in a model of the thalamocortical system that bistability might play a role. This is a model by Steve Esser and Sean Hill where you have a full, detailed model of thalamocortical system. This model can stay awake, sleep, and you can also simulate TMS. And in this preliminary, work, what's been shown is that in wakefulness, if you do TMS when the model is awake, you have this kind of response. So these are different thalamocortical modules. You see activity circulates. You have a good, complex response. Of course, it's a model, but then you open potassium currents. You actually increase activity-dependent potassium currents. Or you increase inhibition. And the model shows that you give, after TMS, there is an initial activation, and then everything shuts down. And then activity recovers. So we thought, well, let's investigate this, whether this is actually a downstate, a silent period due to bistability. The thing is that from the scalp is not easy. We have good indications that the wave triggered in sleep by TMS are like sleep slow waves, because if you hit really hard the brain, you can trigger waves that are, by the period amplitude point of view, they really look like delta waves. But that's not enough. So intracranially, from local field potential, it is possible to infer on the downstate, that is on the hyperpolarization of neurons, which is reflected in the LFP by a suppression of high frequencies, because there is synaptic silence there. So you can measure and infer on the downstate based on the spectral features of the LFP. Suppression of the frequencies above 20 Hertz, it's likely that you have a downstate underneath. So we took advantage at this point of intracranial data in humans during wakefulness and sleep. But in this case, the perturbation is not a magnetic perturbation from the outside. It's a direct cortical perturbation with electrical single pulses from the inside. But the principle is the same. It's the same duration, and it's a cortical perturbation. And then you record the LFP. So this is the response in wakefulness. This is the response in sleep. Sorry, this is wakefulness is red, sleep is blue. But then you can, start looking, more into the data and see what's underneath these waves. So first of all, you replicate basically the TMS-EG finding by the intracranial point of view. And then you look into the details, and you, for instance, perform time-frequency decomposition, and you see that when there is this negative going phase in sleep, you have a suppression of high frequencies, which is strongly suggestive for what we know of a downstate. Neurons are becoming hyperpolarized. Then there is a resumption of power, actually a rebound of power. Then the next hypothesis we wanted to test is that this silence period is a killer for causal effects, because you have a silent period, and we know from intracellular studies and in vitro studies that after the downstate, activity resumes in the network stochastically, which is a killer for, causal interactions and causal complexity. So what we measured was the phase locking factor. So basically the memory of, this neuronal population of the perturbation, and it's long. There's no suppression, and it's a long-lasting memory or phase locking, causal effects, deterministic effects in wakefulness, whereas in sleep, after the downstate, it's killed. Even though power recover, there's no causal trace of the perturbation. This is a killer for complexity, because the complexity we measure is the complexity of deterministic activity. And if you lose that, complexity is gone. Then we wanted to move to link this, local dynamics to the overall complexity. This is work in progress, something we just started. So what we do is that we put an EEG net, 256 net, on top of the intracranial stimulation and recording. This is a very unique situation. And in this case, you can link local activity, where you can infer on downstates, whatever happens to the neurons, to the global dynamic as we measure it with TMS-EG, because we have a full sampling of the scalp, and we can also compute complexity of the spatial-temporal pattern. This is the deterministic activation produced by a direct cortical activation in a human during wakefulness. So the move is stuck, basically, but you see, the kind of data we get. So then we can link neuronal dynamic to complexity. So this is the wakefulness response, this is the sleep response, this is the intracranial, this is the scalp level, the intracranial level. Here we can perform this time frequency decomposition. We can detect the downstate, and then we see that preliminary data, the complexity stops growing where you have the downstate. So that suggests, in a way, that at least during sleep, bistability plays a role. Now, we moved back to the patients because we said, well, that's promising. Let's see, maybe the patients, they have an extreme bistability. We can see well from the scalp. And actually, if you perform the same analysis in vegetative state patients, you see that the downstroke of the wave is underlined by this suppression of high frequencies and an interruption of phase locking. And patients who are recovering, the basic change is that this downstate is gone and phase locking becomes longer and PCI grows, right? So this links, in a way, overall complexity in pathological condition to local dynamics that we can interpret based on physiology of sleep. So by the physiological point of view, by the point of view of finding new ways of helping complexity recovery in these patients after brain injury in general, it's important. It's important, I want to remind, because we have many patients where brain activity is there, but it's stuck in a low complexity state. And as I said, maybe it's just a matter of threshold, you can push it out of that. Exploiting what we know about the downstates and all the wealth of work that's been, carried out in sleep and slices during this slow wave pattern, increased potassium current, increased inhibition, differentiation. There are many ways, I don't go into this, by which, lack of power in the activating systems, excessive inhibition, cortical differentiation, even partial cortical differentiation, and so on, they can converge into this common finite pathway that is bistability and low complexity states. And these are all reversible in principle. So the challenge here is that, yes, you have a share of disconnection and loss that is structural, but then you also have a share that is functional, and this can be recovered. And of course, we want to take advantage of all the means we have to do this, from the TMS-EG to the intracranial to the perturbation in vitro. I won't show this, but there are also nice work where this being replicated by Mavi Sanchez-Vives in Barcelona, where you do perturbation recordings in the slice in different pharmacological conditions, simulating sleep and wake, to understand how you can manipulate complexity. And then, the idea is to put everything together into models one day. The point being restoring complexity in these patients, possibly. And thank you for your patience and all these sorts of findings. So this EU grant, very important for us. HBP, the Human Brain Project, McDonald Foundation, very generous. Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, and all the labs that work on this.
Loss of physiological connectivity in the physiological brain, is it correct?
Yes.
Or you have also a bistability in the vegetative state, or?
Yes, the idea is that bistability plays a role in all cases where also in anesthesia. So, because we see the same kind of response, whenever you have this loss of complexity, which correlates very well with loss of consciousness, you have this slow wave with the negative going phase of the wave that is, it seems to be associated with suppression of firing and hyperpolarization in neurons, as we can infer from the LFP and so on. So the idea is that, for instance, in sleep and anesthesia, the structure is clearly there. So structural connectivity doesn't change. But effective connectivity depends on the postsynaptic responses of neurons. And if you have a system, you have to imagine that you have a system where a node become active, go and transmit in a feed-forward manner his activation to another node. And what the other node does in wakefulness is that it reacts in a stable way, feeds back. This node is feeding back again, and you have all these reentrant interactions. But imagine now the situation where this node becomes active, or you're perturbing it. You have a feed-forward sweep. It goes to other nodes. And the best thing these nodes can do is to activate for a short period and then plunge into a silent state. Then when they recover stochastically. There's no phase locking, no memory of whatever happens. So feedbacks are disrupted, and basically you have a feed-forward system. So what happens, due to these bistabilities, you are transforming a complex system in a feed-forward system. Theoretically, that would be unconscious. Not only that, it's very interesting because this downstate, I didn't want to go into the theory part too much, but actually, let's see if I have a figure. No, I don't have it. Anyways, the downstate, it's interesting because integrated information depends on the fact that you have causal effects, non-stochastic, deterministic effect, and that you have information, different perturbations that give rise to different responses. This is the information part. When you have a downstate, you have, first of all, that any kind of perturbation converges into a stereotypical downstate. So you have causal convergence, that is loss of information. Then when activity resumes, it's stochastic. So you have loss of causality. So you never have effective information that is the basis for phi, for integrated information. So it theoretically makes sense, but it makes sense biologically. And the striking thing is that we see this in brain injury. And not only in vegetative state patients. I didn't say this for the sake of time, but we see this in stroke patients. There is a ring of brain around the lesion that is in this bistable low complexity state. Of course, the rest is fine. But meaning that you have a lesion, you have a problem because you have a lesion, but I think that 50% of your problem are due to the fact that you have a perilesional area that is in a sleep-like state bistable dynamic. And that's potentially reversible, in principle.
Do you think that at this part of your research, it makes sense to apply PCI across species?
Not yet. No. No, you know why? Because PCI is not an exact, it's obviously a coarse measurement, right? It has the flavor of phi, but it's not exhaustive. It's not really quantifying the system's ability to integrate information in absolute terms. It's doing so in relative terms, within a subject or a human subject who are conscious and unconscious. And it's already a miracle that it does it across subject, across conditions. But it's not the measure of integrated information. It's the flavor, and it's it measures relative changes coarsely for the general capacity for information integration, upper bound. I don't know. It has to be formalized. But it's far from exhaustive. So let's say instead that this was the perfect measure, that with optogenetics and some future tools, I could do what phi requires, that is, all possible perturbations in all possible ways of all possible combinations of neurons, group of neurons, on all possible temporal scales. 50 years on a mouse, probably. Then you have to do all possible mid partitions to check for integration. Let's say you can do this fast. And that this measure can be generalized. It's absolute, because it's exhaustive. So I can compare my brain to a smaller brain, to a different brain, to a neuromorphic computer. And let's say that I can calibrate it on what? The only thing I can calibrate it on is my experience. So I would know that when I'm now conscious, awake, and I perform this exhaustive measure, I have 2 2 trillions of trillions of phi is 2 trillions of trillions. Then I anesthetize myself with propofol. I don't exist as far as I'm concerned. The best thing I can know, the Cartesian, Descartes is cogito ergo sum. The only thing, the evidence, and I say, I didn't exist. I trust it. And my phi was 10 millions. Not 0, but 10 million. So I can say, as far as I'm concerned, based on what I know, and the kind of experience I have for consciousness as I know it, when I am 2 trillions of trillions, I am like this. When the measure goes down to 10 million, it feels nothing. I mean, I have no, no remorse, no pain, no nothing. I don't exist. Then I take this measure and I perform the exhaustive measure in an octopus. And I find that in the octopus brain, it's like, less than 10 million. It's 2 millions. What can I say? I mean, it's the only thing I can, it's, inference to the best explanation. I say, okay, well, the octopus is probably less, it feels less than me when I'm anesthetized. But it's, of course, it's an inference, but what else do you have to judge? An octopus brain. Yes.
I have very general, probably quite stupid question, but it seems to me that according to your model, consciousness is a state of the brain. It's not a cognitive process. It's not the consequence of a cognitive process. It's something that is there. And I wonder what's the relationship with other cognitive processes. If they do arise from consciousness, if they require consciousness, and then so is it how the human brain is built that creates consciousness?
Well, there are several dissociations between consciousness and, depends on what you mean by cognitive processes. I mean, like, give me an example. Give me.
There's no task in it. You just stimulate and
No, it's crucial. It's good that we don't have a task. You know why? There's a big misunderstanding. For instance, theories of consciousness that are derived from cognitive psychology, I can name one, for instance, the global workspace neuronal theory. I don't know if you're familiar with that. So the way it works, there was a big misunderstanding. Now they're realizing it, but there was a huge misunderstanding. What they did is that they at some, the story, you have some, stimulations, sensory stimulation, you can perceive them or not, right? When you perceive the stimulation, you do a task. It's task relevant, you say, I saw it, and you press. When you don't see it, you say, I didn't, for instance. Now, or you just don't respond, you don't react. What they see is this beautiful neuronal correlate that is the fronto-parietal ignition. So activity, when you don't see it, it's all in the back of the brain, and it's short-lasting. When you report that you've seen it, this activity goes to the frontal lobe in a non-linear fashion, and it lasts for 300 milliseconds or so. Now, people, but you know that you can be very conscious without the frontal lobe. I don't have the figures here, but there are patients with no frontal lobe whatsoever, a few cases, but, telling. Then, people came up with the no-report paradigm where the perception, it is not task relevant. The stimulus is not task relevant. And what happens is that the frontal lobe is gone completely. There's no ignition, there's no nothing. It's all in the back. So, this is not to say the front versus the back. I don't care. I mean, for me, it's wherever this core of complexity is, it's fine. But how many? So this is a big misunderstanding. Because what? Because you were confounding executive function. You were putting executive functions, working memory, and all this decision to act in the picture. You take that away. You take pure perception. I've seen it or not, but I don't have to report. No, it's my problem. It's my business, and you don't have that anymore. So there are many dissociations between cognitive, and this is also the mistake that we do in patients, because in patients you assume, oftentimes, we conflate being with doing, or consciousness with action. You can be fully conscious just by looking at the fireplace with the flames and be completely absorbed in that, with no reflection, no working memory, you don't want to do anything. Maybe those are the best states, like the ones that meditators look for, and it's, great consciousness, but it's fully devoid of any action. Actually, we try to get rid of action oftentimes in our life when it's possible. But so there is this problem with this. So I think what this theory tries to do is to distill experience out of all the rest, irrespective of sensory input, because you can dream, and irrespective of executive functions, because you can be there without doing anything or deciding to do anything. So that's what it tries to do. Of course, there's a challenge because, distilling, then you're left with, you need a theory because you don't have many readouts. Maybe you had the question, yes.
Yes, it's a bit of a technical question. Do you envisage or have you tried extrapolating this paradigm you've been showing to other modalities, brain mapping modalities that can be used to describe spontaneous activity, beside EEG, and you think if you haven't done it, you think that would be conceivable? There are so many that you can use.
Yeah, in humans, so I had one try, which was a failure. That was fast optical imaging. That is not the absorption, but it's the phase of the scattering. And signal-to-noise ratio was horrible, so I couldn't even interpret the data. That was one. I would love to combine TMS with MEG, but the technical aspects of that are probably very complicated. Imaging in the sense of, fMRI or so, the problem is that this complexity has a time course that plateaus at 300 milliseconds. So what I'm afraid of is that, which is also the time scale of, basic phenomenological conscious events. So it is estimated that each state lasts for 300 or 500 milliseconds or so. And actually, this is the time course where you reach maximum complexity, and then it fades. So I'm afraid that the temporal solution could be, for now, but maybe tomorrow, yes.
Did you ever think to apply this knowledge for letting the patient to communicate the local units, patient to communicate with the other?
Using TMS? No.
Using key, PCI, maybe without TMS because it's too easy.
Because, so in my understanding, now I will ask you to specify the question, but in my understanding, this is a measure of, coarse measure of a capacity for consciousness, but it's not, it says nothing about the content or what you're conscious of, or, it's a capacity measure. So how would you implement communication, for instance?
Maybe in a binary communication, the distribution of the integrated complexity will change in the brain. So you could select the electrons, do a map of PCI in the brain, and try to train the patient to have two different configurations.
I see what you mean. There are two problems here. One, TMS, EG, is very much...
Without
okay. Well, then using complexity as a BC, basically some sort of complexity. But this would amount to entropy in the end because you don't have a perturbation. So that would be a different kind of complexity.
Yeah, it's an inner perturbation, self-initiated perturbation.
Yes. So it's a different story. I have to think about, but it's very different from what we do. It's interesting. Yes.
So is it possible that the patient report wasn't there, but it was, but he doesn't remember?
Yes. Absolutely. This is an absolute basic limitation of our ground truth. So the problem is that you could wake up, you were actually dreaming, but you wake up and for some mechanism you forgot. So this would be a confounding factor in your receiving operating, curve, and it would be a false negative. What do you have as a solution? No, the thing is, no, but it's an excellent question. I forgot to say that. It's an excellent question. I mean, this is a problem. So basically, all this is good as long as you have a ground truth that you trust. The thing is, what do you trust better than your own experience when it comes to consciousness? There's nothing else. If you think about, this is the only thing you can trust. And the challenge, I mean, it's already, the effort you have to make is to put yourself in conditions where consciousness is there, but disconnect. The problem with we had a paper, with the ketamine paper, we struggled to publish the paper because anesthesiologists were saying, we were invading the field of anesthesiology, and the anesthesiologists, they were saying, you're unconscious. Yes, but you are telling a crazy story that you were in a flat, the world was becoming flat, bidimensional, you were floating, flying, then you were meeting dead people, telling you, go back in the room, don't die, and all these stories. I mean, really long stories. They were just not responding at the moment, like dreaming. So, by the anesthesiologist's point of view, consciousness is motor responses. And it was hard to, push or let them accept the fact that ketamine is a conscious state because you have a report. So this was already difficult, right? And it's already, an effort to go into conditions where there are these dissociations and all this. But the absolute limitation is that, then you could forget. And you have to accept, we have to accept that. But there's nothing we can do about it. There's no better, benchmark than that. The only thing we can do is to understand so well the mechanism of memory that we can actually have a readout. Okay, in this case, he said, I don't remember. But the memory was also not working. So then you can you can distill more and more. But yes, this is true. Also, it is true that you could wake up and confabulate, make up a story. But that's the only ground truth we have. The axiom is your experience.
What do you think about another kind of perceptual perturbation, like for example the local global condition, delivery pattern, like for example Sovara or is this reliable or?
Well, in terms of, so again here, the local global is, there are two problems. Well, there's one problem in the rational and one problem in the empirical results. Problem in the rational is that they need to be task relevant. So you need to pay attention at least. If I do the local global paradigm, the Bekenstein or Jean-Remy King, and I'm conscious and healthy, and I just don't pay attention, I'm distracted, you won't see any effect. Even when you use a decoder, you don't see it, right? Have you tried it? Ah, okay. No. Well, yeah. Well, you don't see that. There is no detection, right? Just because I'm not paying attention to the thing, okay? So it requires that the subject consider that input relevant, counting it, paying attention to it, or so on. So it can be absent in conscious controls. Then when you try the local global in minimally conscious patients, and you look at the time domain P3, the sensitivity is 14%. So you're missing 8 patients out of 10. When you use a decoder, the sensitivity grows to 30%. But then Sovara finds a global response in coma, hypothermic, sedated patients. Then you know, what happens is that with the decoder, you increase the sensitivity, but you lose specificity. So the trade-off is really, I mean, the accuracy is very low. But because there is this, again, conflation between executive function, some sort of executive function, and being there. What is your thought about it? So no, I mean this we tried it. We were very since it's such a simple method, we were very into it, and we tried it. You know, it took a lot of, because it's a long paradigm on patients, and then after 10 minimally conscious patients where it didn't work, then we saw the literature. Actually, we went back and we said, but it's 40% and 14%. And then it's, okay, you can do the coding, but it's 30. But then the Tsovara paper came out, and you find it in half of the patients who are completely unconscious. So we gave up.
I was wondering if it ever happened to you, while investigating REM dreams, that someone wakes up and says, I had lucid.
It never happened.
I am conscious inside my dream, and maybe there are some, I don't know, some neural patterns that can be trained.
Never happened. No.
Do you think it will be working?
It could be interesting. It's very, very difficult experiment. But
there is people training these dreams.
yes, this is true. No, it's a very interesting.
At lucid dream, you can report it because it's like
Yes. Yes. Very interesting. But I think it's difficult. It's true. With trained people, you could. Yes.
So thanks again.
Thank you.